Howdy of you delicious people, I'm here today to review Deliverance. So, this movie really just does come off as four guys are canoeing, and yeah, like a little bit of things end up going horribly awry during this, but it just comes off as four guys canoeing. And I'm like, well, I guess this is an exciting adventure to go and watch this film. Uh, this probably really isn't a movie that holds up anymore. I really have to go on and say that there's probably more exciting films like the River Wild, or like this would be somewhat similar to The Wrong Turn. But yeah, like I was kind of like surprised by this movie by just going on and having this feeling of like that's all like that's all that this movie delivers us, like deliverances us. um so yeah, there's no there's nothing any kind of memorable thing coming from this movie also, besides the horrible event of the whole like pig sounding thing, and the whole like guy in the underwear, and like the only thing that's also just a takeaway from this movie is probably dun 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 dun, and that's about it. That's really about it. Like nothing else. Like all of this is to like be too often a bunch of lines that are far too generic. Um, I would probably much more recommend people going on and seeing the Anthony Hopkins, Alec Baldwin movie, The Edge, rather than going and seeing Deliverance. That movie seems much more interesting and more eventful. Uh, so, with that said, Deliverance is a awful film just because it's nothing. We have these big actors in place for what reason? And yeah, it is what it is with this film. So, teeing up, what can I say about this movie that already feels like I'm going into spoilers because it's a movie about nothing? So we have these four guys who are decide to go into this land because there is going to be a river that is to go through this part of town, and they're starting to evacuate it. And so Lewis wants to go on, who is Burt Reynolds, and go with these guys to visit this river before it ends up non-existing anymore. And so that leads the other three guys to go along with him. So once they do go on and do that, we eventually find these four people ending up bumping into the wrong men. And that is to almost lead to them possibly being taken advantage of, possibly to be choked and killed, and possibly to lead a number of our characters injured as well as dead, to the point of them possibly having to go on and figure out what all their story is going to be, and how is it exactly that they're going to figure out how they can try to avoid jail time from this events that occur. So, with that said, that is the most vaguest thing that I've probably ever said as far as a teeing up part of this film. But really, there's nothing else I could say. because I need something for spoilers. So with that said, and I'm sure spoilers when we get to that isn't going to be that long also. So hey, it's going to be a short review today. Isn't that nice? How long is this freaking movie and how short will this review be? Because it's just canoeing and rafting, and there is some bumps along the way, but what can you say? Let's go on into that double 5 time territory, because it's about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to get to spoil Deliverance. Right now, this movie is currently available on Netflix. I would have to say the grading of this movie is to be that this movie is just like, it might be relevant on some app somewhere, but I don't feel like this is a real movie that you should really go on out of your way to watch, because simply you can find much more interesting films, exciting films, and not have to take this time to watch this movie. But hey, if you were to go on and just like the simplicity of this film, I can't argue that with you. So with that said, let's just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time. Spoil this movie. Let's go into it. So, in the beginning of this film, we have 4 guys who are driving their way through this town. And so we have Lewis explaining that there is going to be a dam being let loose, and that eventually the water will all come through, and the river that they are going to canoe through is no longer going to exist, and the town is going to be destroyed. And so this town is somehow getting evacuated, and that's the kind of story we're rolling with here. So we have these 4 men who make their way to meet up with this old man, and they try to go on and get gas from him, but then they also ask, like, hey, like, do you think that you're going to be able, or do you think that you would want to go on and, like, drive our cars to the other part of this river? And, of course, the old man goes, well, of course not. So we then have the 4 men who are to find these guys called the Griner family. And we have a guy named Lonnie who's... So we have Drew. We have Drew that goes on and has his guitar, and he's just starting to play away. And so all of a sudden, the banjo kid is to be playing along. And so we start having them just... And like, that's the whole thing. And I'm like, you know, where have I ever heard this song before? And I'm assuming at one point, one time, that I had probably heard this through a number of people who normally have guitars, because this is probably one thing that they probably were to have easily learned at some point. So we have Drew and we have Bonnie who are playing these duets on this banjo and this guitar. And I'm like, wow, this is an exciting movie. Yeah. So, we push on, and we have, of course, Lewis, who is talking to one of the grinders, to one of these guys to pay them for their services. And he's like, well, like, I'm gonna have $50 to do all this. And Lewis is like, well, like, how about 40? And the guy's like, sure, because Lewis was to offer him 30, and so they had to haggle. So they pay these guys off, and so now we have Lewis and Ed that are in one car, and Bobby and Drew that are in the other. And Lewis is driving like crazy. He's driving all over the place. And we have Ed, who's desperately yelling to Lewis, is like, you're going to kill the both of us before we even get to this river. So they're driving their way there. They're just... And so finally they go on and they make it to the river after they were to make this one turn. And funny enough, when they turn back, Ed is telling Lewis that maybe the locals should try to help them find where this river is. And Lewis is like, no, I'll find it. I'll find it. So when Lewis and Ed kind of pull back, the grinders are telling them, it's like, well, hey, like this river is to be, of course, so big, and you guys are like, you guys can't find it. And Lewis is like, oh no, we'll find it. So they eventually stumble upon the river, and so they get everything prepared. They get their canoes together, and so Lewis and Bobby are going together in their canoe, and Ed and Drew are going in their canoe. So we consistently have Lewis calling Bobby chubby for some reason. So we have Lewis and Bobby, and Lewis is kind of telling Bobby everything to do, to the point where eventually Bobby's kind of sick of that, and he wants to, like, switch it up. Ed and Drew are both going really well. It seems like they're kind of in sync with one another. So there is some very rocky areas and so on and so forth, but it seems that everything goes really well. One canoe is to be fairly wooden, and one canoe is to be very like metal. So eventually there's going to be something that happens to the wooden canoe somewhere down the road. So they go on, and it seems that everything is going pretty well. They're both, it seems like all four of these guys are really enjoying things. So eventually we get to a point where they are to, of course, rest. And so we have a moment again where Drew is to be singing this song about when he is to die and go to heaven. Like, that's when he'll have religion and all these other this other kind of really, it's a very interesting song, but I couldn't quite catch all the lyrics. So we have the four of them going on here and setting up camp. Bobby is to mention how he has this inflatable bed that he's going to treat as his lover, and and I thought that was a pretty good joke. And so he goes on to sleep in his bed, and we have Lewis, who is also talking about a possible, like, the future. And like, we also have Lewis is to kind of like say this again when he puts this arrow through this fish, and he has this feeling that, like, machines are going to crash and they're just going to be, like, left to their own devices. And so Ed is to go on and tell Lewis that, like, well, hey, like, if anything horrible happens, like, at least it won't happen here. And so that's the one thing to think about, Lewis, is, like, for all the horrible things that might happen in the world, like, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and so it's not going to happen here. So Lewis is to start to hear a noise, and so he goes out in the forest to check it out. And all the guys are like, okay, what was that noise? All of a sudden, Lewis comes back and scares everybody. And he's like, yeah, I guess I couldn't figure it out. So everybody just gets ready to go to bed, and they wake up the next day. So we again have them go on and continue to canoe, but we switch it up with certain characters. Bobby is to talk to Ed, or Lewis is to talk to Ed and tell Ed that, hey, like, you go on and you, like, take the chubby guy. Like, I just can't, like, I can't deal with him today. So Ed is to go with Bobby, and Bobby is saying that, like, he would rather go with Ed because, like, Lewis was badgering him the whole time, was yelling at him the whole time, and he just can't deal with a guy like that. And Ed is like, okay, yeah, like, hey, man, like, let's just go. So Lewis and Drew are together. So we have Ed and Bobby that are up front, and so eventually they are to continue to canoe their way. And so they stop because they notice two people that seem very unusual. So both Ed and Bobby are to get out of their canoe and meet these two people who are to be called Mountain Man and Toothless Man. You could probably figure out which one is which, right? So Ed and Bobby are to try to be polite and are to ask these guys like, hey, like, you guys lost? Do you guys know where you're going? But the more and more that they talk to these guys, they start to realize that maybe these guys are to possibly have something that might be illegal here, and they're trying to scare Ed and Bobby off. And so Ed is telling these guys, is like, well, hey, like, if you guys have some kind of like still here, like if you guys have some like illegal alcohol or something like that here, like we're gonna have no problems like forgetting that we were even here. And so the mountain men were talking to these guys and saying like, well, hey, like where are you guys thinking about going? And they were mentioning that they just wanted to go to the entry and kind of pick up their cars because they just wanted to just go on this canoeing trip. And so the two of these guys, the mountain man and the toothless man, are to mention that like this river doesn't lead to the entry. Like you guys are on the wrong path. So the more and more that we talk with these guys, the more it seems that Ed and Bobby are not going to get out of here. And so what ends up happening is Ed ends up getting belted to this tree, and the mountain man is telling Bobby to start taking off his clothes, all of his clothes. So Bobby is, of course, just wearing his underwear, and then the mountain man starts chasing after him and is to grab onto him and is to eventually start forcing Bobby to say to sound like a pig and to have him squeal. And that's of course when the mountain man goes on and takes advantage of Bobby. Ed is choking with this belt and is looking at this toothless man, and he's just like and so just kind of laughing this off. So after the mountain man is to do what he is to do to Bobby, now we have a moment where both the mountain man and the toothless man are kind of conspiring to think what they're going to do to these guys. And so Ed is to see off in the distance that both Lewis and Drew are kind of slowly but surely getting this canoe over to where the other canoe is. And so Lewis is setting up to go on and shoot one of these men with his arrow. We also had a moment in this movie where Ed was to try to position his arrow to hit some deer, and when Ed was to go out into the forest, he tried to kill this deer and he completely missed. And then Ed was to go on and was to meet back with the guys who were kind of setting up camp to wrap everything up. And the guys end up asking Ed, it's like, hey, did you hit anything? And Ed's like, nope. And so they kind of justify it to just be like, well, hey, like, there could be some really good, like, bowsmen that, like, can go 3 years without hitting anything. Like, it just takes, like, a long time. Or eventually, like, some bowsmen will go on and, like, have certain psychological, like, things that prevent them from killing something. So now we're back with Lewis preparing this bow, ready to kill. So we have like the guys kind of passing the gun back and forth, thinking about what they're going to do to these guys. And so Lewis is to take his arrow and kill this mountain man through the chest. And the guy with the gun is to crazily run off. So now we have a moment where everybody is trying to think what exactly they should do here. We have Lewis who is asking if anybody knows anything about the law, and Drew was to just say that he was in jury duty once, and that's all he knows. And so Drew is to possibly convince these guys to try to go on and do the right thing and carry this body to the authorities and tell them what had all happened. Because if they hide this body, it's murder. So Lewis is in the camp of just wanting to bury this body because no one's probably going to find him anyways because of how small this town is. And so Lewis is having that idea, and eventually the other two guys, both Ed and Bobby, are to go along with that. So then Drew is to go along with it also. So Drew then goes on with the guys to carry this body, to bury it. And so when they get back into their canoes, all four of them together, we have Drew, who then goes on and is to not put on his life vest through some very rocky water terrain. So Ed is consistently telling Drew to put on his life jacket, and Drew will not listen. And Ed is getting very afraid of Drew and what he's thinking. And so Ed kind of wants to pull off to the side, so that way he can really get Drew to kind of snap out of this. And all of a sudden we end up having Drew that falls into the water during this horrible time, which all of a sudden now we have Ed that is going through this kind of waterfall-like moment with a bunch of these rocks, and all of a sudden now Ed's canoe is snapped in half, and all the rest of the guys, both Bobby and Lewis, are to fall out of their canoe. And so we're just going on and seeing a number of guys all be falling down these rocks in this waterfall. Ed is grabbing onto his bow and arrows and I would assume hoping, not trying to jab himself or kill himself by accident. So we have finally a point where there's the part of this water that seems to be an okay place for bodies to just start plopping up. And so Ed is to first be the one who is to kind of swim his way over to the shore part, and then Bobby and Lewis follow. And Lewis is to now have his leg broken, and so they take Lewis's body and they prop him up on these rocks, and they tell him to just kind of stay there. He's not going to go anywhere because of his leg being broken. So Lewis is to consistently mention to the group that Drew was shot somehow, and they're like, what? How was he shot? So everybody's freaking out, and so Bobby is making the conclusion it must be that toothless man that is to be up on these rocks trying to shoot them and kill them, because he wants his revenge. So Ed is telling Lewis and Bobby to stay down here, while Ed is going to have to physically go on and climb these rocks to take down this man and try to kill him himself, because really they're stuck down there, and because they can't go further canoeing, uh, because they can't do it at night. That's what they were kind of thinking of, like, well, like maybe we'll just do it at night and the guy won't see us. It's like, well, no, that's very dangerous. It's too rock. There's too many rocks there. It's too wild. It's that it wouldn't be rational to try to attempt that. You could die. So Ed goes off to try to climb up these rocks, and seemingly the next day is to wake up and go after this guy who is to get back up and get ready to possibly kill these men. So Ed gets his bow and arrow ready, and he's trying to like psych himself up to doing this. And so all of a sudden the man is to start to notice Ed talking, and so the guy is to get ready to shoot him, and so Ed fires his bow, and all of a sudden Ed falls, and he falls right onto his own arrow and stabs into his chest. Not a lethal stabbing, but a stabbing nonetheless. So all of a sudden this toothless man goes on to get close to Ed and is getting almost ready, it seems, for a shot. But then we find out that Ed was to somehow jab this guy into this neck, and he falls over and dies. So Ed starts grabbing things from this body and is to start lowering it down, chucking this gun into the water, roping down this body, and then him trying to rope himself down, but then the rope breaks. Ed starts to fall, and kasploosh, into the water he goes. So Bobby was to mention to Ed that Lewis, there were several times where Lewis was to have seemed to have almost died during the night, but luckily he didn't. So Ed and Bobby go back into their canoe, and they end up putting rocks into the toothless man's body and tried to dunk him into this water. And so Ed and Bobby go on to then find Drew's body, and they start to check whether or not that this body has bullet holes, and they can't figure it out. They can't tell for sure. And so they drag the body out, and they put rocks on Drew's body, and so Bobby at that point is like, God, like this just never ends. Like the bodies are just piling up. So before they put Drew in the water, Ed is to go on and mention how he's going to do the right thing for Drew's family, just because Ed and Drew were good friends. So by the time Ed and Bobby are going through these rapids, and through more of this like horrible like water location, and Lewis is kind of in the middle of the canoe, and he at some points is to be yelling and screaming as a life jacket is to be tied to his leg, so to hide the wound. So they make it through, and now Ed is convincing Bobby that they're going to have the story be that this part of water is where the certain bodies were, and everybody is going to understand that and confirm that. So they have Ed go off and find these cars, and now we have uh, a number of these uh, a number of this family that is to all confirm to this guy, hey, you're the guy with the cars, right? And he's like, yep. So Ed is to ask this family that is all in this truck together with all these like recliners and all these things, as if it looks like they're like the Beverly Hillbillies. It's what that's what this family looks like. If you go on and you watch the intro for the Beverly Hillbillies show, man, this car and that looks like very similar. So Ed is to call an ambulance for Lewis, and then it seems that Bobby's doing most of the talking of what had happened, talking to the sheriff. So Ed is to also go on and get medical attention. And so the doctor is telling Eddie, like, man, it's kind of weird for anybody to go on and shoot themselves. Like, you would have to be, like, really clumsy to be able to do something like that. So Ed is just mentioning how he appreciates being in this hospital and the number of items that are to be there. And so Ed is to fall asleep or pass out. So Ed wakes up after he is to get like treated, and so Ed is now talking to Bobby, like, and they're wearing both the same clothes or similar clothing. So Bobby had to go on and had to forcibly change his story because it seems that the guys were not believing what originally he said. And so Ed is grabbing Bobby. It's like, you didn't tell them the truth, did you? And Bobby's like, no, of course I didn't. I stuck to our story, but I tweaked it and I changed it a little bit. So Ed is now running to Lewis, who is to seemingly be awake at this moment. And so Ed is to tell Lewis quickly, hey, we had to change our story. All of a sudden, this cop is walk into the room also, and Ed tells Lewis, it's like, did you hear what I said, Lewis? And Lewis is to say, like, man, those rocks were pretty, like, hard on my head. Like, I don't remember anything. I don't remember anything at all of what happened. Just kind of say, like, oh, like, the only persons that are going to have the story is going to be Bobby and Ed. That don't ask Lewis anything because he won't remember. So now, after everything is to kind of settle down, we have Bobby and we have Ed who are in these like making it into these vehicles, and so Bobby is asking Ed, "Hey, do you want me to drive Drew's car back?" And Ed's like, "No, I think I'll do it." So we have the sheriff that is to go on and tell these men, reconfirming their story, and then the sheriff is to tell Ed that he never wants to see these people in this town again, and for these guys to never go on and do anything like this ever again. And so, as this town is honestly getting evacuated anyways, and so on and so forth. So we have Ed who drives back home and is to meet with his wife and is to meet with his son. And so it seems that things are to go on and be back to normal. But then all of a sudden, here. We have Ed who is having this nightmare about this hand that is coming out of this water. We have Ed that is to wake up from his nightmare, and his wife is trying to comfort him I'm sure a number of these guys are to have these horrific nightmares of all the things that they were to witness via this whole event. So with that said, that's how the movie just ends in this horrific like nightmare. So with that said, I think I'm just going to quickly get out of here to put out a short video for today. So that's nice. I'm going to get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.